The January wind cut through Boston like a knife, but inside the small third-floor apartment at 847, Riverside Drive, it felt colder than the street outside. Chen pressed her hand against the ancient radiator in the bedroom, confirming what her breath had already told her: it was ice cold. Again. 7 months pregnant, she could see her breath misting in the air as she pulled another blanket from the closet. Her hands trembled, not just from cold but from the realization that was settling over her like frost: her father-in-law had turned off the heat. Again. For the third time this week. Richard Morrison owned this building. He owned half the buildings in this neighborhood, actually. And he'd made it very clear that his son had married beneath him when Marcus brought Emma home 2 years ago. A Chinese-American woman from a middle-class family, working as a high school art teacher, she was everything Richard had warned his precious son against. Emma heard the apartment door open and Marcus's familiar footsteps in the hallway. She met him in the kitchen, where their dinner, the soup she'd made that morning, had gone cold hours ago. "The heat's out again," she said, keeping her voice steady. "I called the building super 3 times. He says there's nothing wrong with the system." Marcus set down his briefcase, exhaustion written across his face. At 32, he looked older lately, the stress of trying to please both his father and his wife aging him prematurely. "I'm sure it's just a maintenance issue." "Dad wouldn't, your father cut the heat, Marcus." Emma's voice was quiet but firm. The super told Mrs. Rodriguez on the second floor that Mr. Morrison gave specific instructions. Quote, "The third-floor unit doesn't need the same level of service as the other apartments." Marcus's jaw tightened. "He said that?" Mrs. Rodriguez heard it directly. "She came up to check on me this afternoon, brought me hot tea." Emma wrapped her arms around her swollen belly, feeling the baby kick in response to the cold. "Your father is freezing out his pregnant daughter-in-law because he's still angry you married me. I'll talk to him. You've been saying that for 2 years." Emma moved to the window, looking out at the Boston skyline glittering with warmth and light. Somewhere out there, in buildings just like this one, people were warm. Safe. Not being punished for the crime of marrying someone their family didn't approve of. "Marcus, this isn't about talking anymore. This is about our baby's health. It's 40 degrees in here." Marcus pulled out his phone, his face flushed with anger now. "I'm calling him right now." "Don't." Emma turned from the window. "I already did. He didn't answer my calls, but he texted me back." She held out her phone. The message was brief and brutal: "Tell Marcus's mother and I will be at the club if he needs us. Some apartments take longer to heat than others. Perhaps you should have considered accommodation quality before making life choices." Marcus read it twice, his face going from red to white. "Jesus Christ. I'm so sorry. I'll fix this. I swear I'll fix this." But Emma had heard those words before. She'd heard them when Richard forgot to include her in the family Christmas photo. When he loudly discussed Marcus's old girlfriend, blonde, wealthy, appropriately connected, at their anniversary dinner. When he'd offered Marcus a position at Morrison Properties with the casual mention that, of course, this opportunity might have been different if you'd made different personal choices. "I'm calling a hotel," Marcus was saying, scrolling through his phone. "We'll stay somewhere warm tonight, and tomorrow I'll find us a new apartment. We don't need his building or his, with what money, Marcus?" The question hung in the cold air between them. They both knew the answer. Marcus's salary barely covered their current expenses. Richard had made sure of that, offering his son just enough to be dependent but not enough to be independent. It was a cage made of gold-plated wire, and they were both trapped inside it. Emma's phone buzzed. A text from her mother: "Baba wants to know if you need anything. He's worried about you. Says Boston is very cold this time of year." Emma stared at the message for a long moment. Her father. Chen. The man she'd been protecting for 2 years, keeping at arm's length because Marcus's pride couldn't handle the truth about Emma's family. Marcus thought Emma's father ran a small import business. Technically true. What Marcus didn't know was the scale of that small business. What he didn't know was that Chen's company, Chen Global Industries, had revenue that made Richard Morrison's real estate portfolio look like a lemonade stand. Emma had hidden her background because she'd wanted to be loved for herself, not her family's money. She'd watched too many of her friends in San Francisco attract partners who saw dollar signs instead of people. So when she'd met Marcus at a teaching conference, when he'd fallen for the art teacher from California, she'd simply omitted certain details. Like the fact that her father's import business controlled 40% of rare earth mineral processing in North America. Like the fact that she was the heir to a $4.7 billion fortune. Like the fact that the modest apartment she'd lived in during graduate school had been purchased with cash from a trust fund that generated more monthly interest than Marcus made in a year. She'd wanted ordinary love. She'd gotten it. And now that love was freezing in a cold apartment while her father-in-law played power games. "I'm fine, Mama," Emma texted back. "Just some apartment issues. Nothing serious." Her mother's response was immediate. "Baba says if you need anything, you call him. He doesn't care about Marcus's pride anymore. His daughter is pregnant and cold." Those are fighting words in his book. Emma smiled despite herself. Her father's tendency toward protective overreaction was legendary in their family. When she'd broken her arm in 3rd grade, he'd nearly bought the playground equipment company just to sue them. When a college boyfriend had cheated on her, Wei had somehow arranged for the boy's father to lose a major business contract. Emma had made him promise to never interfere in her life again. But this was different. This wasn't a broken arm or a cheating boyfriend. This was her baby's safety. And maybe, just maybe, it was time for Richard Morrison to learn that some people shouldn't be underestimated. "Marcus," Emma said quietly. "I need to tell you something. Something I should have told you a long time ago." He looked up from his phone, concern crossing his face. "What's wrong? Is it the baby?" "The baby's fine. But there's something about my family that I haven't been completely honest about." Emma took a deep breath, feeling the weight of 2 years of secrets pressing against her chest. "My father's business isn't exactly small. It's actually," her phone rang. Chen's name flashed on the screen, and Emma knew her father well enough to know that his patience had finally run out. "Hi, Baba," she answered in Mandarin. "Don't hi Baba me," Wei replied, his voice tight with controlled fury. "I just got off the phone with someone who knows your building super. Emma, why is my daughter living in an apartment with no heat in January? Why is my granddaughter being frozen by that pompous real estate nobody? Baba, it's complicated." "No, it's simple. You are 7 months pregnant. It is 40 degrees in your apartment. Richard Morrison thinks he can freeze out my daughter because he doesn't like that his son married a Chinese woman." Wei's voice grew colder. "That is not complicated, Emma. That is war." Marcus was staring at her, confused by the rapid Mandarin. What's going on?" "Tell your husband I want to talk to him," Wei said. "Now." Emma switched to English, her hand trembling slightly as she held out the phone to Marcus. "My father wants to speak with you." "Your father?" I don't speak." "He speaks perfect English. Better than mine, actually." Emma pressed the phone into his hand. "Marcus, there are some things about my family that I need to explain, but first, please just talk to my father." Marcus took the phone, his expression wary. "Hello, Mr. Chen? This is Marcus Morrison." Emma watched her husband's face transform as Wei spoke. Confusion gave way to shock, shock to disbelief, disbelief to something that looked uncomfortably like fear. I didn't know," Marcus was saying. "Emma never mentioned." "Yes, sir. I understand." "No, absolutely not. That's not what I..." "Yes, I agree that's unacceptable." "Tomorrow morning?" "Yes, sir. I'll make sure Emma is comfortable tonight." "Thank you." "Yes, sir. I'll tell her." He handed the phone back to Emma, his hand shaking slightly. "Your father is Chen. As in Chen Global Industries Chen. As in Forbes list Chen. As in one of the 50 wealthiest people in America Chen. Yes, Emma said simply. You're an heiress. Yes. To billions of dollars. Approximately 4.7 billion, though the number fluctuates with market conditions. Emma kept her voice steady. I didn't tell you because I wanted you to love me for me, not for my family's money. I wanted what we had to be real. Marcus sat down heavily on their second-hand couch, his face pale. Jesus, Emma. We've been living like this for 2 years while your family is worth. I'm not worth anything except what I make myself, Emma interrupted. That money is my father's, not mine. I'm a teacher because I want to be a teacher. I live in this apartment because it's what we can afford on our salaries. I don't want my father's money, Marcus. I never have. But you let my father. Marcus looked around their cold apartment, understanding dawning in his eyes. You let him treat you like you were nothing. You let him think he was better than you. I am better than him, Emma said quietly. Not because of money, but because I don't need to freeze pregnant women to feel powerful. She moved to sit beside her husband, taking his cold hands in hers. But Marcus, this can't continue. Not for me, not for our baby. Your father needs to understand that actions have consequences. What did your father say to me at the end? Emma smiled, remembering Way's final words. He said he's sending someone to install a thermal imaging camera in our apartment building. And that you and I are moving to a hotel tonight, his treat, while some adjustments are made to the building's heating system. He was very specific about those adjustments. Marcus's phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. This is Jennifer Walsh, Mr. Chen's assistant. A car will arrive at your building in 15 minutes to take you to the Four Seasons. Your suite is booked for the next week. Please pack what you need. Mr. Chen has asked that you let Mrs. Morrison rest and stay warm. He will handle everything else. Emma, Marcus whispered. What is your father going to do? Emma thought about Richard Morrison's smug face, his casual cruelty, his absolute certainty that he held all the power in this situation. She thought about her father, who'd built an empire from nothing, who'd survived poverty and discrimination in countless battles, who'd taught her that the best revenge was not anger but precision. I honestly don't know, she said. But I do know that my father doesn't make idle threats. And I know that Richard Morrison just made the biggest mistake of his life. Outside their window, the first snowflakes of a winter storm began to fall. Inside the apartment, the radiator remained stubbornly cold. But Emma didn't care anymore. Help was coming. Justice was coming. And Richard Morrison had absolutely no idea what was about to hit him. The Four Seasons suite was warm. Blissfully, almost sinfully warm. Emma stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows watching snow blanket Boston while Marcus unpacked their overnight bags with the careful movements of a man whose world had just been turned upside down. I should have known something was different about your family, he said finally, hanging her coat in the closet. The way you never worried about money. The way you knew about art and culture and everything. I'm a teacher, Marcus. Teachers know about art and culture. Teachers don't usually have parents who book presidential suites at the Four Seasons with one phone call. Marcus sat on the edge of the massive bed, his head in his hands. God, Emma. My father has been treating you like, and the whole time you could have. Could have what? Thrown money at the problem? Emma moved to sit beside him. That's not who I am. I don't use my father's money to solve problems. I never have. But you're using it now. No. My father is using his money to protect his daughter and grandchild. There's a difference. Emma took Marcus's hand. I'm sorry I didn't tell you earlier. I wanted to. 1,000 times I wanted to. But I'd seen what happened to my friends when people found out about their families. Suddenly everyone treated them differently. Every friendship had an ulterior motive. Every relationship was suspect. I wouldn't have, wouldn't you? Emma's voice was gentle but firm. Marcus, be honest. If I'd told you on our first date that my father was worth billions, would you have seen me the same way? Would you have fallen in love with the art teacher, or with the heiress? Marcus was quiet for a long moment. I don't know, he admitted finally. And that's probably the most honest thing I've said all night. Room service arrived, a meal Emma hadn't ordered but that appeared anyway, courtesy of Chen's assistant. As they ate, Emma's phone buzzed constantly with updates. Jennifer Walsh, Mr. Chen's team has installed thermal imaging equipment at 847, Riverside Drive. Initial readings confirm apartment 3F is averaging 40 to 42 degrees while surrounding units maintain 68 to 72 degrees. Documentation being prepared. Jennifer Walsh, building inspection scheduled for tomorrow morning, 8 a.m. City inspector personally requested by Mr. Chen. Mr. Morrison has been notified. Jennifer Walsh, Mr. Chen requests you rest and not worry. He has everything under control. Marcus read the messages over her shoulder. What's your father planning? I genuinely don't know. But knowing Baba, it'll be thorough, legal, and devastating. Emma set down her phone. He doesn't do things halfway. When he decides to act, he acts with precision. Should I be worried? Are you freezing your pregnant daughter-in-law out of spite? No. Then you're fine. Emma smiled. My father is very specific about his targets, Marcus. He doesn't do collateral damage. Whatever happens will be aimed directly at your father, not you. Marcus's phone rang. His mother's name flashed on the screen, and he answered with obvious reluctance. Hi, Mom. Emma could hear Catherine Morrison's shrill voice even from across the table. Marcus's face grew progressively paler as his mother spoke. No, I didn't know about that. What inspector? Mom, I don't think this is. Yes, I understand Dad is angry, but... She's my wife. Of course I'm going to. No, we're not staying at the apartment tonight because it's 40 degrees. I don't care what Dad says, it's not safe for Emma or the baby. He hung up abruptly, his hands shaking. My father is furious. Apparently an inspector showed up at Morrison Properties an hour ago with a warrant for building records. Something about systematic heating violations across multiple properties. Systematic? Emma raised her eyebrows. Your father's been doing this to other tenants? I don't know. Maybe? He's always been. Marcus trailed off, understanding dawning. He's always been selective about which tenants get priority service. I never thought about it being a pattern. Emma's phone buzzed. This time it was a call from her father. Hi, Baba, she answered, switching to Mandarin. Thank you for the room. It's beautiful. Good. You're warm? Wei's voice carried the controlled intensity Emma knew meant he was working on something big. Very warm. What did you do? Nothing yet. I'm just gathering information. Wei paused. Emma, did you know your father-in-law has been systematically denying heating service to tenants he considers undesirable? Immigrants, minorities, anyone he thinks might be a problem. It's all documented in the building maintenance logs. Quite careless of him, really, keeping such detailed records of his discrimination. Emma felt something cold settle in her stomach that had nothing to do with temperature. How many tenants? 14, across 6 buildings. All within the last 3 years. Wei's voice hardened. Your situation isn't unique, daughter. You're just the one that made him notice. The others couldn't afford to leave. They've been suffering in silence. Marcus was watching her face. What is it? Emma switched to speakerphone. Baba, Marcus is here. Can you explain in English? Marcus. Wei's voice carried weight even through the phone. Your father has been running what amounts to a discrimination scheme through his properties. Selective heating denial targeting tenants based on race and ethnicity. It's been going on for years. Marcus's face went white. That's illegal. That's a federal crime. Yes, it is. Which is why the Department of Housing and Urban Development will be very interested in the documentation I've acquired. Wei paused. Marcus, I want to be clear. This isn't about revenge. This is about stopping a pattern of abuse that happened to extend to my daughter. Your father created this situation. I'm simply making sure the appropriate authorities are aware of it. What's going to happen to him? That depends on the investigations. But at minimum, he's looking at substantial fines, potential criminal charges, and civil lawsuits from every tenant he's discriminated against. Wei's voice softened slightly. I'm sorry, Marcus. I know he's your father. But this needed to stop. After the call ended, Marcus sat in silence for several minutes. Emma waited, watching her husband process the magnitude of what was happening. I knew he was prejudiced, Marcus said finally. I knew he didn't approve of our marriage. But this, using his properties as weapons against people. I never thought he'd. He looked up at Emma, tears in his eyes. I'm so sorry. I should have seen this. I should have protected you. You couldn't have known. I should have believed you when you said the heat was being cut deliberately. I should have stood up to him 2 years ago. Marcus stood abruptly, pacing the hotel suite. Jesus, 14 tenants. 14 families freezing because my father thinks they're beneath him. Emma's phone buzzed again. Another message from Jennifer Walsh. Mr. Chen requests your presence at 8:47, Riverside Drive tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. City inspector will complete building review at that time. Mr. Chen believes you should see the thermal imaging results firsthand. Driver will collect you at 8:30 a.m. We're going back to the apartment tomorrow, Emma said. My father wants us to see the inspection results. I'll call my father tonight. Warn him that he needs to get a lawyer. No. Emma's voice was firm. Let him be surprised. Let him feel what it's like when someone with more power than him decides to act. He's spent 2 years making me feel powerless, Marcus. Tomorrow he learns what real power looks like. Marcus looked at his wife, really looked at her, perhaps for the first time seeing not just the art teacher he'd married, but the woman she'd always been underneath. You're different than I thought. I'm exactly who I've always been. You're just seeing the parts one kept hidden. Emma moved to the window, placing her hand on her belly where the baby was kicking, responding to the warmth in her mother's elevated heartbeat. I've spent my whole life trying not to be defined by my father's money. But you know what I realized today? There's a difference between not using money and pretending it doesn't exist. What do you mean? I mean that money is just a tool. It's not good or evil, it's just power. And power can be used to hurt people or help them. Emma turned to face Marcus. Your father used his power, his properties, his money, his position, to hurt people. My father is using his power to stop him. That's the difference between us and them. Marcus crossed the room to wrap his arms around her, carefully accommodating her pregnant belly. I love you, he whispered. I loved you before I knew about your family, and I love you now. That part hasn't changed. I know. But Marcus, things are going to be different after this. Your father is going to know the truth about my family. Your mother, your friends, everyone is going to know. Are you ready for that? Are you asking if I'm ready for people to know my wife is an heiress? I'm asking if you're ready for people to know your wife has more money and power than you'll ever have. I'm asking if your pride can handle that. Emma kept her voice gentle. Because that's going to be the reality, Marcus. Once this comes out, everyone will know. Marcus was quiet for a long moment. I'd be lying if I said my ego wasn't struggling with this. But you know what I keep thinking about? What? Those 14 families. The people my father hurt because he could. Because he had power and they didn't. Marcus tightened his embrace. If your father's money can stop that, if your family's power can protect people who can't protect themselves, then I don't care about my pride. I care about doing what's right. Emma felt tears prick her eyes. This was the man she'd married. Not the one cowed by his father's disapproval, but the one with integrity and honor underneath the fear. "Tomorrow is going to be interesting," she said. "Tomorrow," Marcus agreed, "my father is going to learn that he picked a fight with the wrong family." The thermal imaging camera told a story that was impossible to deny. Emma stood in their apartment at 9 a.m. the next morning, watching the city inspector study his equipment while her father's technical team documented everything with professional precision. The camera showed their apartment, 3F, glowing blue and purple with cold, while the apartments surrounding them blazed orange and red with warmth. The heating system was clearly functional. The denial of service was clearly deliberate. "Mrs. Morrison," the city inspector said, his voice tight with anger, "I've been doing this job for 15 years. I've never seen such clear evidence of systematic discrimination. The building's heating system has manual overrides for each unit. Someone has been deliberately shutting off heat to specific apartments." Richard Morrison stood in the hallway outside their apartment, his face flushed with fury and something that might have been fear. He'd been served with inspection warrants for all 6 of his buildings, and city officials were crawling over every property like ants. Catherine Morrison stood behind him, her usual imperious expression cracking under the weight of what was unfolding. "This is absurd," Richard blustered. "Some tenants simply don't maintain their thermostats properly, Mr. Morrison." The inspector's voice cut through his excuses. "The thermal imaging shows that the heating system is delivering warm air to every unit except the ones occupied by minority tenants. That's not a thermostat issue. That's a federal crime." Chen had arrived 30 minutes earlier, flanked by attorneys and looking like exactly what he was, a man who'd built an empire and knew how to use every tool at his disposal. He stood now in Emma's freezing apartment, his expensive coat open because even at 40 degrees, he wanted to feel what his daughter had endured. "Mr. Morrison," Wei said quietly, his accent barely noticeable after 50 years in America. "I want you to stand right here and feel this temperature. I want you to imagine my daughter, 7 months pregnant, sleeping in this cold for the past week. Mr. Chen, this is clearly a misunderstanding, no misunderstanding." Wei's voice could have cut glass. "You deliberately denied heating to my daughter because you disapproved of her marriage to your son. You discriminated against her based on her race. And in doing so, you exposed a pattern of similar discrimination against 14 other families." Richard's face went from red to white. "I don't know what lies your investigators have, the building maintenance logs tell no lies." One of Wei's attorneys stepped forward, holding a thick folder. "Every heating service call, every maintenance request, every manual override of the automated system. All documented. All showing a clear pattern of denying service to tenants with non-white surnames." Emma watched her father-in-law's face as understanding set in. He'd been so careful to never put his prejudice into words, to never say explicitly what he felt about his daughter-in-law. But he'd been careless with documentation, assuming his position and wealth would protect him from consequences. "Dad." Marcus stepped forward, his voice heavy with disappointment. "Tell me this isn't true. Tell me you haven't been doing this to people." "Marcus, son, you have to understand, don't." Marcus held up a hand. "Don't try to justify this. Yes or no? Did you deliberately cut the heat to our apartment?" The silence stretched painful and long. Catherine Morrison broke first. "Richard, for God's sake, tell them it was a mistake. Tell them you didn't mean, of course I meant it." Richard's composure cracked completely. "You married a Chinese woman, Marcus. You threw away your heritage, your future, everything I built for you. I thought if she was uncomfortable enough, if she realized what it meant to be part of this family without really being part of this family, she might leave. Make it easy for everyone." Emma felt Marcus's hand tighten around hers. Hearing it said aloud, hearing her father-in-law admit that he'd frozen her out of spite, was somehow worse than knowing it had been true. "And the other tenants?" Wei's voice was deadly quiet. "The Korean family in 2B? The Mexican couple in Building 4? The black family in Building 6? Were they also supposed to be uncomfortable enough to leave?" Richard Morrison had no answer. Or rather, his silence was answer enough. The inspector cleared his throat. "Mr. Morrison, I'm issuing citations for all 6 properties. The Department of Housing and Urban Development has been notified. You'll be hearing from them shortly about federal civil rights violations. Additionally, every tenant affected will be notified of their right to file civil suits." "This is ridiculous. I own these buildings." "You don't own people," Wei said. "You don't own the right to make my daughter cold because you don't like the color of her skin. You don't own the right to punish families for being immigrants or minorities." He turned to Emma. "Daughter, you should not be standing in this cold. You and Marcus should return to the hotel. I'll handle the rest of this." But Emma shook her head. She needed to see this through. Needed to watch justice unfold in real time. Over the next 2 hours, the full scope of Richard Morrison's discrimination came to light. Maintenance logs showed systematic denial of heat, delayed repairs, and selective enforcement of lease terms, all targeting minority tenants. The technical team Wei had hired documented everything with cameras and thermal imaging equipment that showed exactly which apartments had been denied service. Wei had also brought something else: representatives from a tenants' rights organization, attorneys who specialized in housing discrimination, and translators for the immigrant families who'd been too afraid to complain. Richard Morrison had thought his tenants were powerless. He was learning otherwise. Mrs. Rodriguez from 2B arrived with her 2 young children, both bundled in coats despite being indoors. "He shut off our heat in November," she said to the inspector, her English heavily accented but clear. "My babies were cold for 2 months. I called and called. He said Koreans should be used to cold weather, that we came from cold countries so we shouldn't complain about Boston winter." A Mexican couple from Building 4 told a similar story. As did a black family from Building 6. And a Chinese family from Building 2. The pattern was undeniable, documented, and devastating. "Mr. Morrison," one of Wei's attorneys said, "you're looking at potential federal charges, civil rights violations, and civil suits from every affected tenant. The financial liability alone could exceed $10 million. Add in legal fees, penalties, and the damage to your reputation. This is extortion." "No," Wei said calmly. "This is consequences. You used your power to hurt people. Now people with more power than you are holding you accountable. How does it feel?" Emma watched her father-in-law deflate like a punctured balloon. Richard Morrison had spent his entire life as a big fish in a small pond, using his modest wealth and local influence to lord over people he considered beneath him. Now he was discovering what it meant to face someone who operated on a completely different level. Catherine Morrison was crying quietly, whether from shame or fear of social consequences, Emma couldn't tell. Marcus stood rigid beside Emma, his face a mask of controlled emotion. "The question now," Wei continued, "is what happens next. You can fight this in court, spend years and millions of dollars in legal fees, and still lose. Or what?" Richard's voice was barely audible. "Or you sell your properties to someone who will treat tenants with basic human dignity. You settle with every affected family for substantial compensation. You publicly admit your wrongdoing and commit to never working in property management again." Wei's voice was steel wrapped in silk. "And you apologize to my daughter. Sincerely. For every cold night, every moment of discomfort, every ounce of disrespect you showed her. You can't force me to sell my properties. I can't. But the federal government can freeze your assets pending investigation. The city can revoke your rental licenses. Your tenants can sue you into bankruptcy." Wei smiled, and it wasn't a kind smile. "Or you can sell to me. I'll pay fair market value. Your tenants keep their homes. You walk away with your freedom and enough money to retire comfortably. Your choice." Emma felt something shift in the room. Her father wasn't just stopping Richard Morrison's discrimination. He was dismantling his entire power structure, removing his ability to ever hurt vulnerable people again. "Dad," Marcus said quietly. "Take the deal. Please. Before this gets worse." Richard looked at his son, then at Emma, then at Chen, the man whose daughter he'd tried to freeze out, whose family he'd underestimated so catastrophically. "I'll need time to consider, you have until 5 p.m. today," Wei interrupted. "After that, my offer expires and you deal with the full force of federal investigation, civil suits, and public exposure." "I've been very patient, Mr. Morrison. My patience has limits." Outside the apartment window, snow continued to fall on Boston. But inside, the radiator finally hissed to life as the city inspector manually overrode Richard Morrison's lockout. Heat began flooding into the apartment, chasing away the cold that had been Emma's companion for too long. Chen walked to his daughter and carefully placed his hand on her belly, feeling his grandchild kick against his palm. "Warm enough now?" Emma nodded, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you, Baba." "Always, daughter. Always." Wei looked at Richard Morrison with cold finality. 5 p.m., Mr. Morrison. Choose wisely." As Wei's team packed up their equipment and the inspector finished his citations, Emma stood in the center of her warming apartment and felt the last 2 years of subtle cruelty, quiet discrimination, and systematic dismissal finally come to an end. Richard Morrison had thought he could break her with cold. Instead, he'd awakened a force he could never have anticipated. By noon, the story was already spreading through Boston's real estate community like wildfire. Richard Morrison, small-time property owner with delusions of grandeur, had systematically discriminated against minority tenants in his buildings. Worse, he'd been stupid enough to do it to the daughter of Chen, one of America's wealthiest and most powerful businessmen. Emma sat in Wei's temporary Boston office. He'd rented a full floor of office space that morning because Chen didn't do anything halfway, watching her father orchestrate Richard Morrison's downfall with the precision of a master strategist. "The tenants' rights attorneys are filing a class action," Jennifer Walsh reported, clicking through documents on her tablet. 14 families, seeking compensation for housing discrimination, emotional distress, and violation of fair housing laws. Estimated damages exceed $8 million. HUD is fast-tracking their investigation, another attorney added. Given the clear documentation and thermal imaging evidence, they're treating this as an emergency enforcement action. Morrison's rental licenses are being suspended pending full review. Wei listened to each report with calm attention, occasionally asking questions, always 3 steps ahead of everyone else in the room. Emma watched her father work and understood, perhaps for the first time, why he'd been so successful. Chen didn't just react to situations. He anticipated them, prepared for them, and executed solutions with overwhelming force. Marcus sat beside Emma, still processing the magnitude of what was happening. "Your father doesn't mess around, does he?" "Baba believes in scorched earth policy when someone threatens family," Emma replied. "He's not trying to hurt your father, Marcus. He's trying to make sure this never happens to anyone else. By destroying him. By removing his ability to cause harm." Emma corrected gently. "There's a difference." Wei hung up his phone and turned to face them. "Marcus, I want to be clear about something. What's happening to your father has nothing to do with you. You're still my daughter's husband. You're still the father of my grandchild. This is between Richard Morrison and every person he's hurt through his discriminatory practices. I understand, Mr. Chen. I just wish I'd seen it sooner. Done something to stop it. You were raised by him. You internalized his worldview." Wei's voice was surprisingly gentle. "The question isn't whether you were blind before. The question is whether you see clearly now." Marcus nodded slowly. "I see clearly now." At 2 p.m., Richard Morrison's attorney called. Wei put the call on speaker. "Mr. Chen, my client is prepared to discuss your proposal." "I'm listening." "Mr. Morrison will agree to sell his 6 properties to you at fair market value, as determined by independent appraisal. He will settle with the affected tenants for a total of $6 million. He will surrender his rental licenses and agree to never work in property management in Massachusetts again." "And?" Wei prompted. "And he will issue a public apology acknowledging his discriminatory practices and expressing remorse for the harm caused. Not good enough. The apology must specifically name Emma and acknowledge his treatment of her. It must acknowledge the racist motivations behind his actions. And the settlement amount is $8 million, not 6. There was muffled conversation on the other end of the line. Then, Mr. Morrison agrees to your terms. Good. Documents will be drawn up within the hour. Signing to take place at 5 p.m. today. No delays, no renegotiations. Wei's voice was final. And counselor? Make sure your client understands that this deal evaporates if he speaks to the press before the apology is issued. I want him silenced until his wrongdoing is publicly acknowledged. After the call ended, Jennifer Walsh distributed drafts of the settlement documents. Emma skimmed through the pages, seeing her father-in-law's future being dismantled in careful legalese. Baba, she said quietly. This is generous. You could have destroyed him completely. I could have. But that's not my goal. Wei walked to the window, looking out at Boston Harbor. My goal is protecting you, protecting the other tenants he hurt, and removing his ability to harm anyone else. Destruction for its own sake serves no purpose. Richard Morrison won't see it as generous. Richard Morrison is about to lose everything he spent his life building. He'll see it however he needs to see it to maintain his ego. Wei turned back to face the room. But those 14 families will receive compensation. They'll keep their homes with new, fair management. And Richard Morrison will never have the power to discriminate against vulnerable people again. That's what matters. Marcus's phone had been buzzing constantly all afternoon. His mother, his father, family, friends, everyone had questions. Finally, at 3 p.m., he answered one. Hi, Mom. Catherine Morrison's voice was strained. Marcus, please tell me this is all some terrible misunderstanding. Your father says Chen is forcing him to sell his properties, that he's being extorted. Mom, stop. Marcus's voice was firm. This isn't extortion. This is Dad facing consequences for systematically discriminating against minority tenants. He froze Emma, your pregnant daughter-in-law, because he disapproved of her race. He did the same thing to 14 other families. He created this situation himself. But surely Emma's father is overreacting. Emma's father is protecting his daughter and holding Dad accountable for illegal discrimination. If anything, Mr. Chen is being remarkably restrained. Marcus looked at Emma as he spoke. Mom, I'm ashamed. I'm ashamed that Dad did this. I'm ashamed that I didn't see it sooner. And I'm ashamed that you're trying to defend the indefensible. Marcus, he's your father. And Emma is my wife. My pregnant wife who was freezing in our apartment because Dad decided to use his properties as weapons. Marcus's voice grew cold. I'm on Emma's side, Mom. I'll always be on Emma's side. If that's a problem for you, then we have bigger issues to discuss. He hung up without waiting for a response. Emma reached for his hand, squeezing it gently. That was hard, she said. It needed to be said. Marcus squeezed back. I'm done making excuses for him, Em. I'm done pretending his behavior is acceptable just because he's family. At 4:30 p.m., Richard Morrison arrived at Wei's temporary office, flanked by his attorney and looking like a man attending his own funeral. Catherine was notably absent, whether by choice or instruction, Emma didn't know. The signing took place in a conference room with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the harbor. Richard Morrison signed document after document with shaking hands, each signature removing another piece of his life's work. The settlement payments will be distributed to affected tenants within 30 days, one of Wei's attorneys explained. The property transfers will be complete within 90 days. And Mr. Morrison, you understand that any violation of the terms will result in immediate reinstatement of all pending civil and criminal charges? I understand, Richard muttered. Good. Now, there's one more document. The attorney slid a final paper across the table. The public apology. Read it aloud, please, so we can record it for distribution. Richard's hands shook as he picked up the paper. He read in a monotone voice that couldn't quite hide his fury. I, Richard Morrison, publicly acknowledge that I systematically discriminated against minority tenants in my properties, including my daughter-in-law Chen Morrison. I deliberately denied heating services and other basic maintenance to tenants based on their race and ethnicity. My actions were motivated by racist prejudice and abuse of power. I caused substantial harm to vulnerable families and violated federal fair housing laws. I am deeply sorry for the pain I caused and accept full responsibility for my actions. I am surrendering my rental licenses and selling my properties to ensure I can never abuse tenants in this manner again. The words hung in the air like an admission of guilt at trial. Because that's exactly what they were. Thank you, Mr. Morrison. Wei's voice was cold. You're free to go. I'd suggest you use your settlement money to find a new line of work. Perhaps something that doesn't involve having power over vulnerable people. Richard Morrison stood, his face a mask of humiliation and rage. He looked at Emma with something that might have been hatred or might have been shame. I hope you're satisfied, he said. I'm not satisfied. I'm protected. Emma kept her voice steady. There's a difference, Richard. You tried to make me cold because I wasn't the daughter-in-law you wanted. Now you'll never have the power to make anyone cold again. That's not satisfaction. That's justice. After Richard left, Wei gathered his team for final instructions. The settlement would be announced publicly. The affected tenants would receive their compensation. The properties would be transferred to a new management company with strict anti-discrimination policies. What will you do with the buildings, Baba? Emma asked. Turn them into truly affordable housing. Managed fairly. With proper maintenance and heating. Wei smiled. Richard Morrison's legacy will be helping the very people he tried to hurt. There's poetry in that, I think. As the sun set over Boston Harbor, Emma stood with Marcus in their warming apartment. They'd decided to keep it for now, knowing it would soon be managed properly. Around them, the radiators hummed with heat, chasing away the last of the cold. Your father is terrifying, Marcus said. My father is protective. There's a difference. I'm sorry, Em. For all of it. For not seeing, for not protecting you, for my father's behavior. Emma turned to face her husband, placing her hands on his shoulders. You see now. That's what matters. You stood with me when it counted. You chose justice over family loyalty. That took courage. Your father made it easier. Hard to justify discrimination when someone has thermal imaging evidence. Emma laughed despite everything. Baba does enjoy overwhelming force. But Marcus, you need to understand something. This isn't about my family's money. This is about right and wrong. Money was just the tool we used to make the truth impossible to ignore. I know. I'm just realizing how much I don't know about your family, about your life before me. Marcus pulled her close, careful of her belly. Will you tell me? All of it? Who you really are, where you came from, what your life was like before you decided to hide it. I'll tell you everything, Emma promised. But Marcus, I need you to know, I'm still just me. I'm still the art teacher you fell in love with. The money doesn't change who I am inside. I know. But it does change what we can do together. Marcus placed his hand on her belly, feeling their baby kick. What we can build for our child. Emma's phone buzzed. A message from Wei, rest now, daughter. Tomorrow we start building something better. Your baby deserves to grow up in a world where people are held accountable for cruelty. We're making that world, one property at a time. She showed Marcus the message. Baba wants to renovate all 6 buildings. Turn them into a model for fair housing. He's asking if I want to be involved in the project. Do you? Emma thought about the 14 families who'd suffered in silence. About Mrs. Rodriguez's children bundled in coats indoors. About every tenant who'd been afraid to complain because they had no power, no resources, no voice. Yes, she said. I want to help build something better. Not just for us, but for everyone. That night, as Emma drifted off to sleep in their warm apartment, she heard the radiators hissing softly, felt Marcus's arms around her, and knew that something fundamental had shifted in her life. She'd spent 2 years hiding who she was, trying to be normal, trying to prove that love could exist without the complication of wealth and power. Now she understood, the money wasn't the complication. The money was a tool. And in the right hands, tools could build things or protect people or dismantle systems of abuse. Richard Morrison had learned this lesson the hard way. He thought power meant the ability to make people cold. But real power, Emma was learning, meant the ability to make sure everyone stayed warm. 2 weeks later, Emma stood in the renovated community room of Building 4, watching as Way's team explain the new management structure to assembled tenants. Fair rent policies. 24/7 maintenance hotlines. Tenant councils with real decision-making power. Heat controlled by residents, not by landlords with discriminatory intentions. Mrs. Rodriguez approached Emma shyly, her children hiding behind her skirts. "Mrs. Morrison, I wanted to thank you. My babies are warm now. We all are. You don't need to thank me. What happened to you was wrong. Making it right isn't something that deserves thanks, it's just basic human decency." Still, many people would have just moved to a better apartment and forgotten about the rest of us. Mrs. Rodriguez squeezed Emma's hand. "You didn't forget. Your father didn't forget. That means something." After the meeting, Way pulled Emma aside. "The story is spreading. I've had calls from tenant advocacy groups across the country, asking how we documented the discrimination, how we built the case, how we forced accountability. Are you going to tell them?" "I'm going to do better than that. I'm going to fund tenant advocacy programs in 5 major cities. Train advocates, provide legal resources, build thermal imaging documentation systems." Way smiled. "Richard Morrison's attempt to freeze you out is going to result in better protections for vulnerable tenants nationwide. Sometimes the universe has a sense of humor." Emma laughed, then winced as the baby kicked particularly hard. "This one's going to be a fighter. Like her mother. Like her grandfather." Way placed his hand on Emma's belly. "Have you and Marcus thought about names? We're considering Lily for a girl. After your mother." Way's expression softened with emotion. "She would have loved that. She would have loved you, Emma. The way you stand up for what's right, even when it costs you something. I learn from you, Baba. You learn to be yourself. That's the best thing anyone can learn." Marcus arrived fresh from a meeting with his new employer. Way had quietly arranged a position at a tech firm that actually valued his skills rather than seeing him as a disappointment. Richard had called him a traitor for taking the job. Marcus had called it moving forward. "How did it go?" Emma asked. "Good. Really good, actually." Marcus looked lighter somehow, unburdened by his father's expectations. "The CEO knows your dad," said Chen, personally vouched for my work ethic and integrity. "I didn't even know your father had done that. Baba believes in taking care of family. Your family now." Emma linked her arm through Marcus's. "Whether your parents accept that or not." They stood together in the community room, watching tenants examine their new heating controls, test the emergency maintenance buttons, smile with relief at finally being treated with dignity. "This is because of you," Marcus said quietly. "Because you refused to just accept being frozen out. Because you called your father. This is because of 14 families who deserved better. We just had the resources to make better happen." Emma's phone buzzed. A news alert: Morrison Properties discrimination case sparks federal review of landlord practices nationwide. The story was spreading. Richard Morrison's downfall was becoming a cautionary tale for every landlord who thought power meant the right to abuse tenants. Federal agencies were taking notice. Advocacy groups were organizing. Change was happening. And it all started because Richard Morrison thought he could freeze out his pregnant daughter-in-law without consequences. 6 months later, Emma gave birth to Lily Catherine Chen Morrison in Boston's finest hospital, with Marcus holding her hand and Wei pacing nervously in the waiting room. The baby was healthy, loud, and absolutely perfect. Richard and Catherine Morrison were not notified of the birth. They'd made their choices, and Emma had made hers. Some bridges, once burned, couldn't be rebuilt. But Wei arrived within minutes, bursting into the hospital room with flowers and tears in his eyes. He held his granddaughter with the careful reverence of a man who'd built empires but understood that nothing he'd accomplished compared to this small, perfect life. "She's beautiful," he whispered. "Just like her mother." Emma watched her father with her daughter and felt the last pieces of her old life, the one where she hid who she was, where she tried to be smaller than she was, finally fall away completely. "Baba, I've been thinking about something." "What's that, daughter?" "I want to start a foundation. Using my trust fund. Focused on tenant rights, fair housing, anti-discrimination work." Emma adjusted Lily in her arms. "I want to make sure what happened to us never happens to anyone else." Wei smiled, pride radiating from every line of his face. "Your grandfather would have loved this. Using your resources to protect people who can't protect themselves. That's the true meaning of power, Emma. I learned from the best." Marcus stood beside the hospital bed, looking at his wife and daughter with wonder. "What will you call the foundation?" Emma thought about the cold apartment, the thermal imaging cameras, the moment she'd finally stopped hiding and claimed her full identity. "The Lily Chen Foundation. Named after my grandmother and my daughter. Both women who understood that sometimes you have to be willing to fight for what's right." "Perfect," Wei said. "Absolutely perfect." 3 days later, Emma brought Lily home to a new apartment, larger, warmer, in a building managed by Wei's new property company. The nursery was ready, painted soft yellow with handmade decorations from Emma's art students. Mrs. Rodriguez visited with her children, bringing homemade food and offering to babysit. Other tenants from the buildings stopped by with gifts and congratulations. A community had formed, built on the foundation of shared struggle and collective triumph over injustice. "You know what Richard doesn't understand?" Emma said to Marcus as they put Lily down for her afternoon nap. "He thought making me cold would break me. Instead, it reminded me who I was. It reminded me that I come from people who turn obstacles into opportunities. Your father turned his discrimination into a national movement for tenant rights. And we turned his cruelty into a community." Emma watched her daughter sleep, so small and peaceful and completely unaware of the battle that had been fought before her birth. Lily will grow up knowing her worth, knowing that no one has the right to make her feel small or cold or less than. She'll grow up knowing that when people try to diminish you, you respond not with anger, but with action. Marcus wrapped his arms around Emma from behind. "I'm sorry your introduction to my family was so painful." "I'm not. Because it led to this. To justice for 14 families. To a national conversation about landlord accountability. To a foundation that will help thousands of people." Emma leaned back against Marcus. "Richard Morrison tried to freeze me out. Instead, he lit a fire that's going to burn for generations." Outside their window, Boston stretched in every direction, a city of history and revolution and change. Somewhere in that city, Richard Morrison was probably bitter and angry, convinced he'd been wronged rather than held accountable. But Emma didn't care about Richard's feelings anymore. She cared about Mrs. Rodriguez's children being warm. She cared about 14 families receiving justice. She cared about building a world where her daughter would never have to hide who she was or face discrimination for falling in love with someone from a different background. That was real power. Not the power to make people cold, but the power to make sure everyone stayed warm. And in the nursery, Lily Chen Morrison slept peacefully in her perfect temperature-controlled room, dreaming dreams that would one day change the world, just like her mother, her grandfather, and her great-grandmother before her. The heat was always on. And it would stay that way. Forever.